In today's video, we'll go over some of the basic rules for positives and negatives. The basic thing you should remember, the essential thing to remember, is that when you're multiplying or dividing two numbers that have the same sign, so if you're multiplying two positives or two negatives, or you're dividing two positives and two negatives, you're always going to get a positive result. So if you have numbers that have the same sign and you're multiplying or dividing them, two of them, the result is always going to be positive. On the other hand, if you're multiplying two numbers that have different signs, for example, a positive times a negative or a negative times a positive, or you're dividing two numbers that have different signs, for example, a positive and a negative, or negative divided by positive, you're always going to get a negative result. So if you see a negative result when there's two numbers being divided, it's because they have different signs, and that is usually the way these questions are asked. So let's take a look at question one to see how this works. Question number one reads, if a times b is greater than 0 and b is less than 0, is a greater than 0? Greater than 0 means positive. That is in fact the definition of positive. And less than 0 means negative. That's how you define something negative. It's less than 0. So when you see questions like this on the test, first rephrase them. I find it usually easiest to rephrase them using pluses and minuses, just to remind myself of these rules. So when they tell us AB is greater than 0, I'll write that as, well, A times B is positive. And if B is less than 0, they're telling me that B is negative. So now the question becomes, is A a positive number? Well, I'm multiplying two numbers, I get a positive result. What that tells us is that A and B have the same sign. So if B is negative, A has to be negative as well, which means that the answer to this question is no. Let's see how this is tested in a slightly more complicated question. The question reads, if P is greater than 0, P times Q is greater than 0, and Q divided by R is less than 0, is R less than 0? First, we're going to rephrase this using this pluses and minuses. So we're told that P is positive, P times Q is positive, and the question is Q divided by R negative? We're told my bad. We're told that Q divided by R is negative. So we're told three things, and then we're asked whether R is negative. This is the question. So if P is positive, I'm going to plug that in over here, and we see that P times Q, which is positive, means that they have to be the same sign, either both positive or both negative. So if P itself is positive, Q has to be positive as well. And then we can use that information in this statement. If Q divided by R is negative, it means that they have different signs. So a negative result in division of two numbers is that they're different signs. So if I know that Q is positive, in other words, I can rewrite this now as something positive over R is negative. So if we have a positive divided by R and gives us negative, R has to be negative. They have to be different signs. So the answer here is yes. And let's take a look at the third question. So this question says, if the product xy is negative, which of the following must be true? This is a must be true question, which tends to be a little bit trickier. So I'll go over how to think about those as we're doing this question. The first thing to note is that xy is negative. So I'm going to rewrite that as x times y is a negative number. So always the first step is to rephrase it using these pluses and minuses. And then think about your options. If these two multiply to a negative number, we have a situation like here, which means that they're different. It's either a positive times a negative, or a negative times a positive. So we don't exactly know what x and y are, unlike in some of these questions. We have two options. We know that they're different signs, but we don't know whether x is the positive and y is the negative one, or vice versa. Now, a must be true question, one way you can think about it is it's basically saying which of the things always has to be true. Sometimes you'll see Roman numerals, or you'll just see answer choices like this. It's basically asking which of these 5 answer choices is always the case. Well, if we look at answer choice A is telling us that x is negative, or in order for A to be true, it would have to be the case that x is always negative. Well, that's not the case. We know that x could be positive if y is negative. X is negative only if y is positive. We don't know which of these situations is the case. So it's not true that x is always negative. Same thing for b. It's not true that y is always negative. It's only negative if x is positive, but it could be positive itself if x were negative. Now, c and d are a little bit weirder. They introduce plus and minus. And we haven't talked about, or rather addition and subtraction. We haven't talked about the rules of positives and negatives with addition and subtraction. There are some fairly abstract rules, but we'll skip these for now and go to E and then come back to C and D. So in E, we're told that x divided by y is less than 0, or that x over y is negative. In other words, in order for this to be true, for this answer choice to be correct, x divided by y would always have to be negative. Well, in order for x divided by y to be negative, they would have to be different signs. And although we don't know exactly what signs x and y are, we know that they're always different. So in this first situation, let's call this situation 1, if x is positive and y is negative, then if I were to divide those, I would have a positive divided by a negative, which is negative. Or in situation 2, if x were negative and y were positive, then to divide them, I would get a negative divided by a positive, which is also negative. So no matter what x and y are, as long as their product is negative and they are different signs, then x divided by y will itself be negative. So that's our correct answer. We didn't actually have to think about C and D. And that's a general strategy. If you're going through the answer choices, you don't have to, don't focus too much on ones that you don't know how to do. Try to eliminate the ones that you know how to think about. Sometimes you'll get lucky and get the correct answer. But so how do we think about these with addition and subtraction? Well, the easiest way is to pick some numbers. So let's pretend, for example, so we know that x and y have to be different signs. Let's pretend that x is, well, I don't know, -5 and y is +3. Adding them together gives us -2. And what this shows is that if x and y are different signs, which is what we're told here, that their product is negative, it's not always the case that adding them gives you something positive, because it's not always the case we can get rid of C. And similarly, for D, I can pick, for example, y could be -1, and x could be, so we have -1 minus, x could be +5 this time. -1 minus +5 gives us -6. So it's not the case that y minus x is positive, because it's not always the case. We can get rid of that. So to recap, you should memorize these rules. Keep in mind that the way to get a positive result when you're multiplying or dividing two numbers is that they have to be the same sign. And to get it, if you got a negative result while multiplying or dividing two numbers, that means they're different signs. And when you encounter questions that deal with addition and subtraction, pick some numbers.